Well, welcome everyone to our celebration of 50 years after Stonewall. Some of us were around then, many of us not. I want to thank my co-coordinator, Dr. Stephanie Hsu, who instrumental in putting this together. I'm really excited because I think we have an amazing panel this evening representing a lot of experience and a lot of years in the publishing world, and people who made LGBTQ plus publishing possible and really pioneered that aspect of the publishing industry. And we have young publishing professionals here who are continuing that legacy in their own way. The program really has great bios. I was going to start off by asking everyone to give us a couple of words about themselves, but I feel that we have really good bios. It really tells you how extraordinary each of these individuals is. So I'd like to start off by really talking about the earlier days of publishing and what the atmosphere, the environment was for LGBT professionals in the publishing world. I might start with you, Nancy. Yes.
Well, I wasn't in the publishing world, the big corporate publishing world. I've never worked for a publisher. There was a time when I thought that might be a good idea after I had, thank you. Do I hear that?
I think so.
Okay, is this better? Okay. I've never worked for one of the large houses. I had never worked in publishing. And then a small press in the area where I lived, which I live in Ithaca, New York, about 250 miles upstate, where Cornell University and Ithaca College are. And Crossing Press was there. They needed someone to edit their feminist series. I thought that editing meant you put in commas and you took them out. I was an English major. I had been an English major and I liked to read. And the things that I was reading, I had come out relatively recently before that. I was 40 years old when I started working for them. And one thing led to another. Eventually, I got fired. I did 20 books for them, including, and I have to say I'm really, really proud of this, when I was reading the Sunday Times this past weekend, the book review section had a whole page on additional resources to deal with racism. I don't think that's its exact title, but that was it. And then divided into categories, culture, cooking, movies, blah, blah, blah. When they got to sexuality, there were 2 books. There weren't a lot of books listed for each category. There were 2 books. One was a book by Janet Mock, and the other was Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde, which I published when I was editor of the feminist series at Crossing Press. So for me, there has been this very long period of time where entering the small press world, the only publishing world that I knew personally, was 15 of the most exciting years of my life. And I don't think that I had to face many of the in-office issues that a lot of other people face, because although my bosses at Crossing were not queer, they were in their own way. And so it allowed me to be me. I mean, there was no way that I wasn't going to be who I was. And one thing led to another. I got fired and I started Firebrand, and Firebrand existed for 15 years and was my life's work. It was a perfect match between the skills that I had accumulated, the things that I believed in, and luck and a lot of hard work.
Thank you. So, Michael, you started in publishing. You started in pretty traditional publishing. I think things, by the way, were different, speaking from my own perspective too, between men and women and their acceptance in the workplace.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm sort of parallel to Nancy, but in the commercial publishing thing, I started when 71, I moved to New York. And in spite of the fact that there were a lot of gays and lesbians in publishing, I would say 20%, 25%, something like that. It was really quite high. Absolutely nobody was out. It was, the don't ask, don't tell type of thing. Although, all the gay guys would go to cocktail parties with women, and the women would, that type of thing. And actually, in 1970, the publishing world, if you really want to know what it was like the TV show Mad Men. I mean, that 70 is only 2 years after the last Mad Men episode. Everybody wore suits and ties, white shirts, had 2 to 3 martinis for lunch, which put me under the table. I mean, how you could have 3 martinis and go back to the office, it's beyond me. And I got a job at the old Macmillan Company, quite accidentally, and basically it was a day job. I'd spent the 60s at the University of Chicago being a hippie, political radical type person. But when I moved to New York after, 8 or 10 weeks, where my money was really disappearing, I remember going to job interviews with Random House. I was living with a friend down in the Village, and I had to walk to 50th Street because I didn't have the 35 cents, for the subway. And I thought, this can't go on. Any job, I've got to take a job. And a friend of mine who was working as an editor at Macmillan decided he was going to quit and go to Paris and be a poet. And so we arranged it so that he quit at 10 o'clock and I came in at 11 o'clock. And on paper, we were the same person. With one exception, we'd both been undergraduates at Chicago. We'd both been graduates on the Committee on Social Thought at Chicago. The only difference was I had actually worked half-time for a couple of years at the University of Chicago Press. So originally it was just a day job, and I figured as soon as they figure out who I didn't own a suit, and I was damned if I was going to buy one just for this job. I mean, I had a jacket, a corduroy jacket, but I didn't have a suit, So I figured as soon as they really figured out who I was, they'd fire me, but then I could get unemployment. So that was okay.
Yeah.
And one thing led to another, and actually the things that got me interested was I had a couple of political books. And while I didn't know what the hell an editor did, basically, and you have this imposter syndrome. I mean, you're trying to be an editor while you're desperately trying to figure out, now, what is it that editors do? But politics I really understood. And there was one book I'd inherited. I was low man on the totem pole, being the youngest editor hired. So one of the things I used to do is dump all the problem books on the new editor. So I had this book on the uses of high-rise buildings for public housing. And in the
Sounds really gay.
Well, in the only people of my age would remember this. In the late 60s, the early 70s, that was an incredibly hot political topic. There were lawsuits all over the country about using high-rises for public housing, which is a disastrous idea. And this guy, Oscar Newman, had written a book that was brilliant in his research and his conclusions, but the man couldn't write. And I had been advised, just cancel the book. But once I read it, and I got really interested in it, and I knew what was going on politically, essentially, I think I rewrote every sentence in that damn book, with Oscar. And we published the book, and Romney, George Romney, who was head of what was called Housing and Urban Development at the time, HUD, tried to suppress the book. And they sent in 3 or 4 housing experts that demanded to read the manuscript, you know. And for some reason, which was lucky, they came to me, not to my bosses. So I allowed them to read the manuscript, but it had to be in the conference room, and either I or my assistant had to be present. They could take notes, but they couldn't Xerox anything. And after 3 days, they came to me very proud of themselves, and they found 186 errors in this book, and they handed me a list of them. I couldn't believe they were that stupid. So I said, oh, you know, I was very disturbed, and I would look into this immediately, and I would get back to them, and then they left, and I called up Oscar, and I said, Oscar, get your ass up here. We've got to fix all these things. It turned out that they were utterly minor errors of numbers and things like that. None of them affected the whole argument. So we went ahead and published it. But before that, I wrote Romney a letter, which I wish I had a copy of, but I don't, in which I basically, but very subtly suggested that if HUD changed their housing policy 180 degrees, then this book could not possibly be an attack on them, you know.
That didn't happen, I would assume.
Huh?
I said that, but it did happen.
It did happen. Not only did they totally reverse the national policy, they gave us a press thing in the Senate cloakroom of the Capitol in D.C., you know, hailing this book. And when that happened, I thought, well, you know, there's something you can do here, maybe. And then the next big book I had was by a guy named Chen. He was the son of Eugene Chen, who was Sun Yat-sen's main right-hand man, foreign minister, but also writer of almost all his books. And Jack was a friend of Mao and Zhou Enlai's and all that. And Jack was the first person to come out of Red China after the Cultural Revolution. And he had an appointment with the Department of Education in New York State. And at that time, we had a Senator Buckley, who was the brother of Bill Buckley, the conservative columnist. And they started a campaign trying to drive Jack out of the country. This is right after Nixon had been to China and was reversing his policy, etc. And Senator Buckley introduced a thing in the Senate. He got exactly 2 votes, him and one other person, you know. But what happened was he generated an enormous amount of publicity for the book, which did incredibly better than anybody had expected, you know. Which had also happened with Defensible Space.
So, but here's my question. When you were doing all of this, you were working with all of these people, was your sexuality, ever an issue for anyone? Did you worry that these people would have discovered that you were gay? Was it an issue in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely.
How so?
I was very ambivalent about it. I mean, on the one hand, I had to have a job. I mean, somebody had to pay the rent. And but I decided I would never lie about it. That lasted for about a year into the first Christmas party. And publishers, I don't think this happens, but you can tell me, they used to have enormous Christmas parties where everybody got drunk out of their minds and things got said and done that could be very embarrassing.
But you're not going to mention
lots
here.
Of problems.
You're not going to mention any of that here.
Yeah. Well, what happened was the head of inventory control, who is this incredibly feisty dyke, you know, Puerto Rican dyke.
But you knew she was a dyke.
Oh, there's no way you couldn't. I mean, she was 5 foot, she wore a vest, she smoked cigars, and she was terrific. You know, we were friendly, and she was quite drunk. She came up to me, and she said, I've been wanting to ask you, are you gay? No, are you bisexual? And I said, no. And her face fell, and she realized she'd gone a step too far. And then I said, I'm actually gay. I'm not bisexual. And she became one of my best friends in the company. But I was at Macmillan for 5 years, and I either quit or was fired 5 times.
But not because of your sexuality.
Yes, yes. Once, the first book I ever did, I signed up a book in 73 called The Homosexuals, Who and What We Are, which shows you how long ago that was. And, you know, to sign up books, you had to have the signature of 5 vice presidents, and you had to do these analyses and blah, blah, blah. And I had done all the paperwork, so it was totally legit. But the CEO of the company, a twisted, evil little man called Raymond C. Hagel, had not known about the book until we were preparing for a sales conference in Phoenix, and that's the first time he saw it, and he freaked out and fired me. But then the legal department told him he had to publish the book because I'd sent the DNA letter, the DNA check, plus a letter accepting the book. I thought, just to be safe, you know, I wanted Alan to have the paperwork. So then they had to present the book, and then every other editor, including the editor-in-chief, flatly refused to present it. So they hired me back to present one book, you know? And then on the 5th time was a week after Christopher Street came out. I was one of the founding editors of Christopher Street, and I was fired over that. And interestingly enough, the company's lawyers who, because I'd had these various political books, which had a lot of legal stuff, I'd actually become friends with several of these lawyers. And they spent several hours with me without charging me. And it turned out that in 1976, in the state of New York, it was perfectly legal to fire somebody for being gay. Yes. In other words, if Ray Hagel had the balls to say he was firing me for being gay, he'd have no problem, which the lawyers told me. On the other hand, if he claimed that I'd been fired for cause, that is, I wasn't a good enough editor or something, I had just published for Colored Girls Who Consider Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, I'd done a bunch of books that not only had gotten a lot of publicity, but actually had made a good deal of money. Maybe even more money than, no, not quite. But I was about to say than I ever made after that. But
not true.
And they actually said he'd probably lose that. But then they said, if you want a career in publishing, suing a publishing company that's fired you is not a wise move, right? Which I agreed with.
Keep that in mind.
And I had 47 job interviews. I mean, I think I was the first out gay person in publishing, and it caused a big hullabaloo. And I think everybody wanted to meet the queer editor. Out of the 47 interviews, I got one call back from this tiny little publisher that most people hadn't heard of called St. Martin's Press. And I actually had to have 5 interviews with Tom McCormick, and he finally hired me.
But about that, you know, I mean, but you were out. And so, in a way, you know, that must have been very liberating to know that you could work for this company and work for this man and be yourself. I don't know if that was true for you, Malika. I mean, you started at Penguin, I think, right? Publicity.
Yeah, actually, I was going to say a little anecdote, but my first job in publishing was at Valentine Books in 1982, and very much in the closet I was, and there was a senior publicist who I thought was taking me under her wing, and she had said that she had talked about a summer coming out party. And I took that, oh, she's telling me she's gay. But it wasn't until a conversation much later had progressed that it was a cotillion. So for me, and it was just, I mean, it was years of wearing skirts and dresses, and now if I wear a dress, it's like I'm Mrs. Doubtfire. I don't do that. I don't go down that dirt road. But anyway, with publishing, I think I came out in publishing, and part of my coming out process was probably the Publishing Triangle, which is an organization I was involved with a long, long time ago. But I think there's a bunch of us that came out in publishing this sort of 1982, 1983 year. But it's so interesting hearing both Nancy's and Michael's stories. So, you know, about the whole publishing and how it came to be. I'm sure I'll have other things to add.
Were you ever worried that you would lose a job, that it would, or that people wouldn't speak to you or work with you, or that there would be consequences?
No, I wasn't worried. I was closeted, and you know it's pretty obvious that I'm gay, so it was just obvious. But one thing I do want to say is that every publishing job I've had. As a Ballantine publicist, and I work for 2 agents as well. Every publishing job I've been fired from. I'm not proud of it, but maybe it's passive aggressive. I am going to a therapist. I'm still working on it. It's part of the whole thing.
You know, I mean, just one thing that I would add, you know, the freedom that came from basically having been a feminist and dealing with my own life and coming out in my own life, having nothing to do with what job I had, and then having this publishing world be there. You know, I hadn't thought about doing that. But the freedom that I had to move in that direction and not really think about whether there are going to be any negative repercussions, I think was some of the strength that I brought to the work that I did. I did not have, you know, my UPS man used to deliver cartons of Dykes to Watch Out For and call me Mrs. Barriano. You know, die stamped, Dykes to Watch Out For. So it was like people seemed to have, you know, this is what she looks like, this is, so therefore she must be. And I was fired from Crossing, and I thought that was an ego firing rather than a homophobic firing, because I was told that my books weren't selling enough, which was patently untrue if one looked at the numbers, okay? But I never felt that I was going to have bad things happen to me, other than if I was walking down the street in the wrong place.
Yeah.
That was not part of my work.
Well, so, you know, I'm going kind of
chronologically.
Just bringing us up to current days.
I started in 1984, FYI. So,
did you ever have any worries about being gay in a publishing environment?
I think that my experience was that especially for most of the first half of my career, I think it was more of exclusion, that I self-censored, and so I wouldn't participate in kind of a lot of casual conversations that were happening. And I think that that kind of exclusion, it does then become a work, it becomes a barrier to what you can accomplish, and then you have to work harder to get around that, because so much of publishing really is about about people and their personalities, and who likes you and who doesn't like you and who favors you, and therefore it's not necessarily spoken homophobia, but exclusionary transphobia and homophobia, and
Good point.
You just are not made to feel as if you are part of the in-group, and I have had that experience until March.
All right, well,
When
we
I
can
said, fuck this, I'm making my own company.
infer a few things from that remark. Diana, did you ever have issues?
So I have a little bit of an unusual journey towards like identifying as being queer. I actually didn't identify as such until my mid-20s after I established my career in publishing. But also part of it is because my partner transitioned at the same time. So it was, so it was this whole we've been together for 18 years now. So it's this whole period about whether do we still stay together? How do I identify? Does it really matter? And so I think that really affected how I approach my identities. I identify more as being a woman of color than as a queer person necessarily, but I do know there's so much intersection, and there's very specific issues I felt like I had to deal with that I don't think necessarily, if you are white and queer, have faced the same, sort of difficulties. And so, so when it came to publishing, I was actually very fortunate to always be in positions where my bosses were queer. This is totally coincidental. It wasn't, I think it was probably because the 20% were just, queer, as Michael was saying. But my first boss, Bob Michelle in international sales at Hachette, he was very flamboyantly gay. He took us all to his beach house in Fire Island, for parties. It was not a thing. But we were also a very, very small team of 5 people. And so that gave me a lot of perspective about how working in international gave a lot of opportunities for people that may have not been as welcome on the domestic side, because no one really cared what you did in the international as long as you sold books. And there are always these outliers that worked, that traveled abroad and globally, and I think that also affected my perspective a lot. And then my second boss was Rome Gazeta at the Science Fiction Book Club, and he was the first, fellow queer person of color I ever met in the industry, and that was really fantastic as well. And so I think, that was kind of the difference, because all of my elders, also I think went through a different generational shift. So by the time I came along, they're more mentor figures and people I could look up to, which really helped.
Yeah, thank you. Sunita, any comments about the environment, the publishing environment when you started? And
well, I'm still a publishing baby, so it's never been a secret. It's kind of been if no one has noticed, I felt like it's just because it just goes over their head a lot of the time, but it's never been a secret. It's never been a secret. And I actually remember my interview for the internship position at 7 Stories Press. I was at the time, and I know this is probably going to be a question later, but at that moment I was reading Purple Prose, Bisexuality in Britain. And it's a collection of essays on being bisexual, and it talks about religion and race with bisexuality and gender, and I was reading that at the time, and so I accidentally came out right at the interview when they asked me what I was reading, and so I was reading Purple Prose, and then I was like, oh, okay, well, cat's out the bag, and there were only 2 people at the interview there, and there was only 10 people at 7 Stories Press, and so I came out as bisexual right from the start. The thing that I've always worried about is gender. As a non-binary person, how do you approach gender in the workplace? How do you approach the pronoun conversation in the workplace? I haven't approached that conversation at the workplace, so it's Yeah, I'm gonna say my sexuality hasn't been a problem, and my gender identity hasn't been a problem yet. Mostly because everyone sees me as a cis woman, even though that's not how I identify.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hannah, any comments?
Sure. So I started working full-time in publishing in 2016 in April. And that was kind of around the time that I was also coming out as queer, as a lesbian. And I guess that I was learning how to be a professional person at the same time that I was learning how to be queer. And I grew up in the Midwest. So to me, for the first 6 or 8 months of working in publishing, I thought oh, this just isn't a professional thing to talk about, so I didn't. And then I think it was literally the day after Trump got elected, I went to all my bosses and I'm like, I'm a lesbian. And because it's something I felt very important. And my stance on that has changed so much over the last few years, I think, as it has for so many other people, as I've just been growing into my identity, and also as the world has changed, or as the world has revealed itself to us. And I've also come out as non-binary at work in the past 8 months and changed my pronouns, and have had actually a really great experience with that, which is awesome. I am on the board with the Penguin Random House LGBTQ network, and we are working right now on putting together some literature of here's how to change your pronouns at work and making that available to all different people. And I think that would have been helpful for me, but then we'll, catch the next group.
You're doing it now. Tiff?
That's actually great that you said that, I actually don't know how to, approach the subject of coming out in terms of gender, because that's kind of my whole MO, because I did it from day one when I started at Penguin Random House. I started in October 2016 as an intern at the time, and, I just figured, okay, this is, a new job that I'm starting. How do I want to be perceived as a publishing professional, and kind of how do I want to go about, making a career for myself, not, only as a person, but also as a queer individual, and how, because if I'm going to be working with books, and I want it to be books that I care about, queer books are going to be a part of it because it's a part of my identity. So from day one, I just asked my coworkers, I'm like, hey, I would just like to know what everyone's pronouns are, just so I don't misgender anyone, and because my pronouns are they, them, and I'm non-binary. I'm really fortunate because that's the only job that I've ever had where I literally started it off right off the bat with a clean slate of just really making my pronouns known and defining my gender to everyone.
And not getting a negative.
I'm very fortunate that I just work with just a very, progressive, accepting team. And I had absolutely no problems with that. And for me, it was great because I have no problem answering questions when people ask me them, but I'm kind of bad with being forthcoming with information. So the first coworker who I told my pronouns to, the second day that I worked there, or however, long after a little bit of time, she was like, oh, I hope you don't mind, but I told everyone else your pronouns just so you don't get misgendered. And I was like, yes, thank you, no, I don't have to do it.
Right.
So I just thought that was phenomenal. I'm just so incredibly, grateful that, I work with such a supportive team. And, it is something that I'm fortunate that I, didn't have to worry about.
Thank you. So, we're publishing people. What were the books that were most influential as you were discovering your identities and coming to grips with sexuality, gender? And I think, we have a lot of years here to cover. But Molly, what books were you reading back in the day? What books most influenced you?
Patti Smith.
Yeah.
Patti Smith.
Patti Smith. Hello, Nancy.
Many women's magazines, Heresies, Sinister Wisdom, Conditions, just opened up a big world. And Adrienne Rich. because I related not only, I mean, of course I said I wasn't a lesbian, I just related to her politics, but but the combination of her politics, of her involvement in a large world, and her serious commitment to women was very moving to me. And then I was fortunate enough to get to know her and spend some time with her. And so that, augmented, made everything fuller.
I'm not sure if I can think of like any authors in particular. I'm a big fantasy fiction person, so a lot of the times it was the characters in books, and one particular character that stood out for me a lot as far as sexuality goes is a character in a Cassandra Clare series. Magnus Bane is a bisexual warlock, and there was recently an article about bisexuality and the magical bisexual that appears in fantasy fiction, and there was just something about watching this character of color go through centuries of just being very comfortable with his sexuality. And as a young queer, that meant a lot to me, because even though he started out as a side character in the series, he becomes such a major character later on, and is just, everyone depends on him so much. And even though the magical bisexual is such a stereotype, sometimes I'm just like, if anyone wants to think of me as the magical bisexual, I'm good with that.
Well, in 1970, 71, there were very, very few books published on the topic. If there were 4 or 5 books of gay interest published in an entire year, that was a big year. The earliest books I can remember were Arthur Bell's Dancing the Gaelic Blues. Arthur was a columnist for the Village Voice and the only out newspaper writer in America at the time. Wainwright Churchill, Homosexuality, a Cross-Species, Cross-Cultural Approach. Those are the only 2 I could remember. I mean, they were precious. Oh, and Roommates Can't Always Be Lovers by Legion Jack. I've forgotten their last names, which was published by St. Martin's Press, which is why in like 72, which is why I'd actually heard of it. St. Martin's was the only publisher in New York. As I say, it was a very tiny publisher at the time, and they had published 2 or 3 gay books, which I instantly bought and devoured. So it was on my radar,
There was some mass market publishing being done, in the 50s. Bebo Brinker, anybody? People were like, I don't know. And then,
the mass market.
There was some kind of lurid covers for those books.
Right.
Pseudonyms.
And in basic, in regular publishing, there was this, I met this guy, Ayer, who was like in his 90s when I worked at Crown, and I didn't realize he was a person who had been involved in an attempt to publish gay books in the 30s and 40s, and it was photo books of Hollywood hunks, or they were sexual, but under, they were Hollywood stars, so without their shirts on. So that made it legitimate.
Jeff?
So I kind of joke that I'm the most oblivious trans person on the planet, but I kind of am the most oblivious trans person on the planet. I kind of came into and discovered my identity very later on in life, and when I was struggling the most when I was in grad school for my MFA. So I was struggling not only to figure out my identity as a person, but also my identity as a writer. And really just the help and the influence that I got from my thesis advisor at the time helped me kind of discover myself. But while, I was working that out, I had read Acclamation by V. Hoffman, and there's a scene in that book where one of the main characters is like a high school student, and his English teacher ends up becoming like a confidant of his, and there's a scene where he comes out to him, and that just so almost paralleled my experience, because whereas my mentor was not queer, because of the influence that she had in my life and how she helped me kind of discover myself and discover my voice as a writer and as an individual throughout my own writing, that, scene was just so, kind of poignant to me. And also Vanilla by Billy Merrill. It was the first book that I ever read featuring a asexual protagonist. And there's also, a secondary character in there who's non-binary, and there were definitely like several times in that book where I was tearing up because I had never once before, seen the struggles of someone struggling with their gender and their identity before. Just so beautifully captivated in prose before, and I'm just so grateful that that book exists.
Oh, I'm sorry. So, I guess when I was coming out as queer for the first time, I read The Miseducation of Cameron Post, which I would talk about every day, and my friends know that I do. But that is a really fantastic YA novel that is about a girl growing up in Montana that really kind of reflected my own experience of growing up in the Midwest, and it's absolutely beautiful. And then also on more of a gender front, the poetry of Andrea Gibson, they have a line that is something along the lines of, like, they want you to feel like you're bad at being a girl, but really you're good at being yourself. And that, like, meant a lot to me. Yeah.
So listening to all of you, I've been keeping a list and then, editing. So, because it's so large. I think that the first book that I ever read that had a gay relationship in it that was recognizable was The Front Runner by Patricia Nell Warren. So that just became important to me because it showed me that there was such a thing as a relationship between two men. And then James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, which was so important not only as a novel, but that was like a way that gay people identified each other. In my experience, you'd literally carry around a copy of Giovanni's Room, and somebody saw you, they'd be like, Giovanni's Room, right? And then I think I also, you reminded me, in terms of fantasy, Ursula Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness was incredibly important to me because that showed the possibility of that gender was not, of a world where gender was not fixed, literally not fixed. And that experience, that literary experience, is very liberating to me.
I was also going to say Ursula K. Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness. Octavia Butler is really influential to me, like in an entirely different way, just because she really explores the socio-political dynamics that I think still resonate today. If anyone ever wants to read any single book by her, like just read Parable of the Sower. It's one of my all-time favorite books. I'll talk about forever, and then we'll all get depressed together because I feel like it just reflects our world right now. And I also have to say, like, if we're talking about exposure to, like, queerness, I definitely, was and am a huge, like, manga and anime person. So, like, so I've, and so I think that was actually my really big exposure to like queerness, which is really interesting because it's like a Japanese certain framework of fetishized queerness, which isn't really authentic to like the queer community in Japan at all, or our community in the United States. But they're like, oh, they're Asian people that look like me, and you can have boys kissing and girls kissing, or people switching genders. Ramna One Half is a very formative like anime of my youth. So I think all of that also really had an impact on how that, made me think about queerness starting as a young person.
Well, when you're looking...
Sorry, I just want to also say Annie on my mind, because that has to be said. Nancy Garden, I mean, is that a generational divide kind of thing? Annie on my mind? Patience and Sarah, okay.
Yeah. Orlando.
Oh, sorry, just to add one more thing. As someone who was trying to convince themselves for the longest time that they were something that they weren't, my mind was absolutely blown when I read, it's a poetry collection, but it's When I Was Straight by Julia Marie Reid. And the whole thing, it's poems written to, like, her family members, and like half the book is like when I thought I was straight, and then like I'm coming out as a lesbian, and that just like was like an arrow right in my heart.
Yeah. What are you looking for when you're looking at LGBTQ manuscripts, book proposals? Sure.
I stopped publishing, basically. I'm sorry. I stopped publishing, basically, because the manuscripts that I was getting were not worth, to me, the amount of energy and financial risk that taking them on would have warranted. And some of that is because a huge cultural change between my generation and the particular things that were, the lodestones for us and a younger generation. And it's not just about a coming out story. That was never my thing as a publisher. That was not something that I was particularly interested in. But I just didn't find that the manuscripts that I was getting revealed new things to me, which was my personal measure in addition to the quality of the writing. For a big part of my time at Firebrand, because I was newly out, a few years before, I read Joan Nestle, A Restricted Country. I edited Joan Nestle, A Restricted Country, and I said, I'm a femme. I didn't understand that in a way that was, deeply resonant for me until I saw that manuscript, and then it all made sense to me. So I think there's so little that I have found that's being written for not young people. That people, there's a queer community which has been around for a really long time. It's not about, it's not about praising or congratulating or anything like that. It's like our lives are just not reflected. The reality of our lives, of what day-to-day stuff is like, of people dying, besides AIDS as a centering theme, but just the natural evolution of getting older and having people that you care about die, and having to learn how to deal with that as part of life. And what does it mean to be in a 25-year relationship? When I say to someone that I'm in a 25-year relationship, and I thought I'd never be in a 25-year relationship because I had already been through a 10-year relationship and a blah, 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 and all of stuff, what they say is, oh, congratulations. I don't want congratulations. I want to talk about how do you survive in a 25-year relationship. Right, okay, I'll be quiet.
So what are we looking for? What do you think? So I think we're also looking, being at the other end of the spectrum in terms of age,
right,
that we're looking for books that are relevant to being gay and being an aging population. So that's a little bit different from, I think, a number of you on the panel. Yeah, Michael.
Well, I disagree, I guess, especially with Nancy. in the last couple of years, there have been some remarkably good gay books coming out. I mean, just in the last month, there was Frederic Martel's Inside the Closet of the Vatican, a book published in 22 countries and 16 languages simultaneously. It's an astonishing book. I mean, Frederick maintains that the Vatican is approximately 70 to 80% gay, that the Catholic Church is 50% gay. And he's interviewed 160 cardinals with a tape recorder. I mean, he has the recordings. What's amazing is most of these cardinals are in their 80s, right? They're old men. Good number of them. It sometimes seems like all of them are gay. And a bunch of them have been sidelined by Francis, so, you know, they're sitting in their apartment in Verona or something like that. And here comes this young gay reporter, and Frederick's very well known as gay. He has a radio show, a television show in Paris, and he writes a lot in the newspapers. And he's willing to listen to them for 4 or 5 hours. And after an hour or so, these old gay guys cannot avoid gossiping. They keep saying, I shouldn't tell you this, but did you hear? And it's just amazing what they say. We just learned last week that Francis has read the book and likes it. I mean, among other things, 3 of the last 4 popes have been gay. And they've actually had live-in lovers living in the Vatican, you know, and the only way you can right now there's a war going on in the Catholic Church between a whole bunch of cardinals, mainly led by the American cardinals and some African and some South American, against Francis. And the only way you can who seems to be straight, which is why he's so friendly to gays, because all of the extremely homophobic Catholic higher-ups, cardinals, etc., inevitably turn out to be active homosexuals themselves, you know, and the most reasonable people on this question seem to be the straight people in the Catholic Church.
And
it's
all
the
of them
gay
are men,
people.
Michael.
Yeah, all of them are men. All of them are men. No, Frederick thinks that many people think this is the biggest challenge to the Catholic Church since the Reformation, and that the Church may totally, and it actually may schism over this. I mean, a lot of people in the Church think that that's a very real possibility. But unless they get rid of, what is it when you can't have sex? Celibacy, right. Unless they get rid of celibacy and allow women to become priests, they're not going to be able to solve this problem. You know?
But it's actually that it's something that we're talking about is, I think, kind of astounding, given, you know, the mammoth size and history of the Catholic Church. And I think there's a lot of Catholics who would resist that book or anything like
Surprisingly,
it.
not
Can I just ask you, are you saying also this is an example of the kind of book that you would be looking for, that you would want to edit? Is something that has like, so the kind of LGBTQ themed book that you would be interested in editing would be one that had a kind of broad cultural sweep?
Yeah, I mean, this to me, Frederic Martel is very similar to Randy Schultz. I mean, the job of shoe leather journal, the interviewing. I mean, it took 6 years to write this book. He visited something like 46 countries. He's interviewed thousands of people, and he names every single name. You know, as I say, he tape recorded most of the conversations. He's got those tape recordings, etc. There's that, but 2 weeks ago a book came out called Buying Gay by David K. Johnson, who several years ago wrote a book called The Lavender Scare, which is a reinterpretation of the McCarthy period and which establishes quite clearly, I mean, in the State Department, they ended up firing something like 8 communists and 2,000 gay people. I mean, the whole McCarthy period, or the McCarthyism, was basically a gigantic anti-gay purge, much more than it was an anti-communist purge.
Well, perhaps he didn't like J. Edgar Hoover. That could have been part of the
It's interesting.
for doing that. But we're getting into politics. We're getting a little.
So I'm the type of book that's coming out, and increasingly to me, I mean, there've been half a dozen in the last year.
Well, I think it's also revealing. I mean, we didn't just spring fully formed after Stonewall. I mean, we've been part of history for a long time, but we haven't really talked about it. So I think that's what's perhaps 50 years after Stonewall that we're discovering a little bit more, and people are more willing to look back with a slightly different perspective on events. And looking at it from a gay perspective or an LGBTQ plus perspective. What I find interesting is, you know, the nonfiction, the political, but I also, maybe as a reader myself, I mean, the books that have always drawn me have been books that have strong characters. So, Molly, you're looking at manuscripts. You're an agent. You're looking at manuscripts. What kinds of books are you looking for? What appeals to you? What do you think is going to appeal to, and who are you buying books for? Are you buying them for an older population? Some of the younger population? What draws you? What do you think is going to work?
I took on an intern this summer, and through the whole process of courting her, I'm paying her. It's the first time ever, and I'm trying to tell her what I'm looking for. And usually for the books that I decide to take on, it's something that I wish I could write. It so moves me with the cover letter that comes through the email or through snail mail that I want to drop everything and contact that writer, and I want to find out what happens at the end of this first few pages, or at the end of what questions are being posed in the query letter. I also will say, you know, I need to know what happens. I read for sex as well. I have to have sex in the first 6 pages, or else I'm not interested. Now, with the sex part, I mean, it has to be good, clear writing. It has to be writing that just lifts me, you know, up to the heavens. It has to be something that is so powerful. And I tell, you know, people that either call me on the phone, cold calling, you know, is it clean, lean, and mean? Is it, you know, have you cut it in half? Is it, if it's 189,000 words, no way, Jose, it should be half. It doesn't matter if it's science fiction or a romance. Cut it. Read it out loud, you know, go to writers' groups. I'm not an editor. I don't know how to edit. I can't even speak English sometimes. I need to be moved. I need to be so moved by the book, because I will have to go out with a manuscript on average about 38 times before I sell it. 38 times, and by that time, the author has died, has found another agent, or committed suicide. All those things have happened.
Gosh.
Not because of me, but I mean, all those things have happened. So for me, it's just, it can be anything from Western beards on men, you know, the history of beards, to horseback riding, to dogs. I just sold a novel today about the Wright brothers' sister, who may or may not have had a sexual relationship with her brother. And the novel is like 133 pages, just so wonderful. It's just so wonderful. And I went out just to 10 editors. I mean, that hardly ever happens. It usually takes a year, and this took like 3 weeks. And I just, you know, that doesn't happen. That's just like, doesn't happen. So it has to be something that I know I feel strongly about, that I can sell, and that I wish I had written, and it strikes me wherever my heart is. It has to really strike me here, and then here, but first my heart.
Yeah. Arthur, you know, you've been working at Scholastic for a few few decades.
23 years.
Yeah, okay. Didn't want to bring it up, no. I think, would you say, now you're starting a new company, Lavender Scare, and you're looking for new types, for new projects. Is there a difference between what you might have acquired at Scholastic, for example, and what you're looking for now? And what is that difference? How is that different?
It's not so different, it's just that I'm out about it. Like, the mission of my company to publish underrepresented communities and voices, and to proudly say that we're all about LGBTQ and people of color and indigenous writers and minority religions and more, as opposed to saying, sitting in meetings and saying, well, we have to up our percentage by one of this. So the pleasure for me is to say that is exactly what I'm excited about and what I want to publish. So that's the difference, and the difference is that I don't. It's just all back to a thing that I had long ago, which is I just have to love the manuscript to buy it, because I'm the one. I make the decision. But that's just, it's to not have to ram it through a process is a different sort of thing for me. So I can just appreciate writing for writing, or a story for a story, and I don't have to at that point translate that into the language of it's comparable to this book, and so therefore it will have this level of sale. I can make it actually be a great book, and then decide how to reach an audience and make it succeed. So I also have that. It's interesting, that experience. It's not for me. I wish I had written it, but it's a little bit more. I wish I had read it when I was a teenager or when I was a small child. That's the feeling, and that feeling of passion and love that I have when I find something that I really want is the feeling that I project a reader will have. And that's what I look for.
Yeah. Diana?
So I think for myself, I read from a place of curiosity. So if there was a perspective or an idea or a character or a place or any amount of things that, that impresses me, and I'm like so easily impressed sometimes, and it makes me want to learn more and know more about it. That is really what strikes the chord. So, so it has to come from a place in the heart. I agree with that as well, but also for me, it has to have some strong sort of intellectual question, why is this story happening? Why do I want to read more about it? And that really is what drives me. And, and also in terms of representation, I'm also highly aware, about, who tells the stories, how do they tell those stories, and what's my role as an editor to help spotlight, groups that have been historically and systemically, oppressed, in the industry of publishing. And so, a majority of my list, just coincidentally, turns out to be marginalized in some sort of way, whether they're of color or they're queer or they're both or disabled. And I think what's really nice about working for my company that I'm at now, which is Tor Books, is that they're very open to having me acquire these books. I was never told no in the acquisition by the acquisitions board because we don't know how to sell a certain type of book, which is very appreciative. I know that's not the experience that everyone has in the industry.
Yep. Tiff, do you have that experience?
So my experience as an editor is a little different because I edit books for a client, and our books are originally in Japanese, so then it's a matter of localizing it and translating them into English and then presenting it to the English reading community. So, and the thing with, and they're all in Japanese, so it's Japanese manga. And the thing with manga readers is they're very incredibly passionate about what they're reading and what they want to see brought over. Because some readers know Japanese already and they're reading the content like in its original language, or they'll hear about it from someone. And now there's almost like a renaissance of queer manga right now, because there's titles such as My Brother's Husband, My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness, Our Dreams at Dusk. And they're just, it ranges from like nonfiction, more memoir type manga, and then there's more like slice of life, like fiction titles. But the one thing that they all have in common is that they're just so poignant and raw and so genuine, and they really touch upon just how like humans feel, and they're just so realistic. And that's the kind of stories that I look into, and I can like turn around and go and look at a backlist of titles that my client has, or look at what series are currently being serialized, and I could think like, hey, I think people are going to absolutely fall in love with this. We should really consider it. So it's a little different than everyone else, because I'm not editing novels proper.
It's similar. Samina, Seven Stories is pretty progressive. They're looking for a lot of LGBTQ.
So I'm a jerk when it comes to acquiring books. I really am. I have a set mind when I'm acquiring, and it can be nonfiction, it could be political, it could be fiction, whatever. However, I want the book to be written about or written by people who are people of color, queer, disabled, or women. Because I am a black, queer, non-binary femme, and so I want to see books written by people like me or written about people like me. If it is a book written about or by straight white people, I will not read it. I just won't. I will pass it up immediately, and it gets me in trouble a lot at work, but I know what I want to read, and I know what I want to put out in the world, and I know what I wanted to see when I was younger. And I don't have, and the other thing, it's like, I won't be passionate about those other books. I know what I'm passionate about, and if I already know I'm not going to be passionate about it, I'm not going to put the hours into it when I could be reading about genderqueer witches.
Why does that get you into trouble at work?
Yeah.
Because I'm not supposed to say no if someone sends me something, but I say no multiple times a day.
That's part of what being an editor is no, I don't want that. I don't want that. Michael?
I was saying, having an editor's job is mostly saying no. Right. That's been my experience.
Yeah. So, and also, how can you acquire something that you're not passionate about? Because if you're working in a publishing company, you have to represent that book from the moment you acquire it and you force the company to spend money on it to the moment it's published till when it's out there, and you follow up with it and with publicity and marketing for as long as that book exists. People come back to you about it. So, yeah, as an editor. Yeah, the books you acquire. But, a number of you are also writers, which really kind of fascinates me, that Arthur, you've written, Michael, you've written, Hannah, you've written. What are you looking for? What's the impetus to write? They often say that, editors shouldn't write. You have to really be focused on working on other people's work. So what are you trying to do with your own writing?
Well, I want to say that, Nancy, you're getting a lot of "I'm the opposite." And I think that is offered with great respect. But something you said before, that you don't write because you don't want to be in competition with your authors, right? You didn't. Is that an accurate? Yeah.
No, I didn't want to be a writer.
Right, because
it's easier being an editor, not wanting to be a writer.
Right, because you didn't want to be in competition. Isn't that what you said?
No,
necessarily.
Just having.
That's what you said. I'm sorry, in the conversation. I'm quoting you. And please feel free to say that that isn't what you meant. But I am a writer so that I never become, as an editor, a frustrated writer. So I write when I feel like I must write. And anything else that I'm editing, I'm joyfully giving myself over to that editing process, and there's no confusion in my head about this is your book. We are working on your book. I am not writing your book. I am helping you write your book. I'm editing your book. When I want to write, I write my own book. So that keeps those two impulses completely separate. And I think that they're opposing impulses. I think, writing is a solo, self-oriented activity, and editing cannot be, by definition, is a two-person or group experience, and is completely not about you as the editor. It's about the writer.
Well, something sort of interesting has happened. I never wanted to be a writer, so I viewed myself as an administrative writer, jacket copy, promo materials, and all of that kind of stuff. For a small publishing company, you wind up doing all kinds of things that you didn't know that you had to learn how to do. But since I closed Firebrand, since I left, and it's been a while now, I have several authors, not to mention my sweetie, who have been pushing me to write, okay, which is really interesting to me, because it's not like I was trying to get in the back door and saying, if only, And so theoretically, I am working on a manuscript, but I have no idea if it's any good. It's certainly not near completion. It is very much me, meaning I could never write fiction. I'm just much too literal and present in this world to take on an imaginative life that I can sustain on the page. So we'll see what happens. I have great sympathy for my authors in ways that I didn't have before. I gave them all kinds of tips and clues about how to get, scheduling and motivation and blah, 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 and all of this kind of stuff. And now I think, oh my God, it is really hard sitting alone in the room with your computer, and either you put it out there or whatever you use to write with, or it doesn't happen. And so I have much greater respect in that way for what it actually takes to churn out something that didn't exist before.
Yeah. Tiff, you got a Lambda Emerging Writers Award this year, I believe.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I've been applying to Lambda for a few years, and I just got accepted this year as an Emerging Writers Fellow. So I'll be going there for a week this August for a writing workshop.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So what's the impetus for you to write, and what as opposed to being the editor, how do you separate those two?
Well, it helps that the kinds of books that I edit are, the genre is completely different than what I write. I tend to write either young adult historical fiction or, contemporary, fiction centered around, queer characters. But really a lot of what draws me to write is, and what you were mentioning about what you're looking for in books that you want to acquire, you want to find books that speak to you because you weren't able to find such content prior to that. And I constantly think of, if I had read this book earlier, or if I had found this language earlier in life to define how I identify, then maybe I would have come into myself a little bit sooner. And I just want to have the same impact that my favorite authors in my favorite books have had on me. I want to be able to do that to a future generation. So that really is my primary motivation to write.
Michael, what's your motivation? You've written a number of books too. I mean, you're mostly known as an editor, I must say, but you've written books.
Well, originally I basically agreed with Arthur. The first half of the 70s, I swore I would never write because I saw. Perhaps I shouldn't say this, but I saw too many editors who were failed writers,
Yes.
and who were taking, in my opinion, were taking it to some extent out on their writers. So I thought, okay. But after I came out, really publicly, and then for about 5 years, that's all anybody ever wanted to talk about. Basically, I had to start writing to defend publishing gay books, you know. Although I tried very hard not to, I mean, what I used to say is I only write when I have something to say, you know. I mean, I'm not a professional writer, but that doesn't mean a person can't write. But a professional writer's life, in my opinion, is, I mean, I've watched it now for 50 years. I've been very closely associated with I think it's a lousy life. You know, I mean, your ego is too much on the line. It's a very, very difficult life. You know, not unlike being an actor or, you know, so I never wanted actually to be a writer, but as I had more and more to say, and basically it was about defending other gay writers that I was publishing or attacking the publishing ethos of the time. That just got me more into it.
But you're writing nonfiction.
Nonfiction. No, I'm fascinated by fiction. I mean, I have published fiction all my life. I have been very, very close to a number of fiction writers, Susan Fromberg Schaefer and Tazaki Shange, and I watch it very carefully, and I don't have that instinct at all. That instinct to make up, you know. I have an instinct to analyze stuff, you know, so I'm interested, all my writing basically is about nonfiction things, you know, and I'm interested philosophically. But I don't have this storytelling imagination, which fascinates me, and I've watched it from very close up. But I just don't have it. It's not part of my psyche in the slightest.
But Arthur, you've done, yeah, I know about Diana, but you've been writing fiction too. Or you have been writing fiction much more than non.
I very rarely write essays or anything, but, you know, I've written 6 picture books. That counts.
It's fiction.
I have to tell myself that because I'm like, I'm not really a writer, but I have actually written some picture books. And I have been working on the same novel for 20 years, which I don't ever intend to finish. So.
Right.
No.
Is that informed by partly by your sexuality, by your being gay?
I think, you know, to some extent, that I can't separate myself from the gayness. You know, it's all that is who I am. Just as the Jewishness is who I am, and the disability is who I am. That's how I experience the world. That's what my brain is. So everything that I produce and do and say and am are those things. If that makes sense.
Diana, yeah.
I was about to agree with Michael in saying that I think the biggest difference between like an editor and a writer is how they conceptualize the construction of a story. And because I also write, you know, I'm also a published academic because I really love just like sitting down and trying to figure out how the other person did it. You know, and I think that really plays a huge role in being a successful editor as opposed to being like a failed writer, is the ability to like have a collaborative imagination with the people that you're working with, because you really have to sit down and shape the story together. And I think that is something that a lot of readers don't think about, is that books are a collaborative process. It's like the author's name on the book, but I always compare book production to, you know, putting up a show in theater, you know, because there's so many people behind your book in various ways, whether they're the sales force, the people who make your book layout, the people who design the cover, you know, the publisher who gives the money. There's so many people that work behind the scenes that readers never know about. And the editor's job is kind of like a director slash, you know, dramaturg / part-time therapist at the bar, and to really bring the text together with the author and point out like the weaknesses, what could be changed, what isn't as effective, and that is also a credible part of like the storytelling process when it comes to bookmaking. So, and as author was saying, I think also because of that, interconnected relationship, I do think that, the editor's tastes and how they process things, intersects with their life experiences. And that also impacts how the book is created, what weaknesses the author may not see, but the editor might see, where we can improve like the strengths. And again, really bolstering like certain voices that may have just been lost in the slush pile.
I'd like to end so that we have a time for Q&A. Sorry, Anna.
Oh, yeah. I also, my own writing is pretty adjacent to publishing. I do sports writing,
Right.
Which, if publishing is a very like creative place where lots of different people are able to thrive, and ideas are what is privilege and all different types of people and ideas, I would say sports writing is not that way, which may not be surprising to too many people, but which for me also was a source of supplemental income, which I think is really important for a lot of people who have lower level jobs in publishing. But for me, sports writing, I did a lot of the articles that came up at our at the website that I worked for, which was writing about swimming. A lot of articles that came up whenever there was some sort of trans or queer topic. They're like, okay, Hannah, you're going to write this and you're going to edit it. Which also meant that all of the comments that happened on those articles ended up going directly to my inbox. And I think that it's, I think with that type of thing, it's important to think about how social media and how the authors who are putting themselves out there are getting interacted with, which I think is something that we can do in publishing better as well. So, yeah, anyway, that was my experience with writing.
I think that's also the single biggest change in publishing has been social media, and then, instant feedback. So what books do you think have been the most important in the LGBTQ publishing world, and what do you think still needs to be done? What would you like to see in publishing? How would you like to see our community represented in the publishing world? And very diverse. I think all of us present a very diverse look at the LGBTQ plus world just on the panel.
Yes, but I think it can be even more diverse, a lot more diverse, and that's what I would like to see, a lot greater intersectionality as you were describing, Diana.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of, I was going to leave the question open for people who wanted to talk about certain stories or novels, because I was actually going to have a critique about the industry. So I don't know if you want me to say that or wait for everyone else to answer.
Go ahead.
Okay,
go for it.
Because I think one of the greatest hurdles that the industry faces right now is the economic challenges that it takes to actually start in publishing, especially if you're entry level. The cost of living in New York is not getting any cheaper, but the starting pay for all entry level jobs for many companies has not changed in over 20 years. Yeah. And it is frankly ridiculous to, expect to it to be that way. And I think the greatest change when it comes to more queer books, more diverse books in general, is to have people behind the scenes being able to work on those books. We need more, as authors saying, a wider representation, not just with authors, but with editors, with agents, with artists and, with salespeople, with booksellers, with librarians, across the board. We just need to have, more people that are actually representative of our country working in this industry. And the biggest factor against it, Yeah, the biggest factor against it is just how hard it is to even get in the door if you can't afford that internship in New York City, or if you can't live here on $30,000 or less a year. And that's something I think people should be talking more about.
That's interesting. Right? Good. Yes, well, I represent also an MS in publishing program, and I feel that we really try to train people and to introduce a more diverse population into the publishing industry, because I think that's the only way that the industry changes. But when I look at what some of those starting salaries are, I couldn't do it. I started a long time ago, and it was tough enough. But nowadays, I really agree. The salaries have not changed significantly in a very long time.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
This has been true for 50 years.
Yeah.
But one of the things I've noticed, nobody ever talks about, but if we're talking practically here, there are a lot of young people in publishing. When I first started in the early 70s, there'd be several publicity assistants, 23-year-old young women, etc., who were living in duplexes. Now, they weren't living on in those days, probably $15,000 a year salary. They were living on daddy's money.
Well,
But these women were highly educated. They'd gone to the best universities in the country, et cetera, et cetera. And some of them, say Amanda Vale, became superb editors. But they were incredibly unfair competition to everybody else. On the other hand, from the publishing point of view, that's why the salaries were so low. Because the people were there who would take, the rich young woman from Shaker Heights comes to New York for 5 or 6 years, in her young 20s. She will eventually go back to Shaker Heights and get married to the rich young man from Shaker Heights. But meanwhile, she's the competition for a lot of other people. And the reverse side of that is in the 70s at the old Macmillan Company, there was a very active program to recruit African Americans. And what we found out is that any African American who is going to be viable as an editor could get a job at AT&T paying 5 times as much money. Again and again and again, third world people who'd started in publishing were being picked off by these other corporations that wanted diversity. So you had those two things working, and I think they're still working.
Well, I think, yes, it's always been the genteel, if you want a job, you want a really nice, cushy sort of desk job, an enjoyable desk job.
Interesting career.
Interesting career, and you don't have to worry about the money? Sure.
Right.
Yeah. When I got my first job in publishing, my father said, congratulations, you now work in the lowest paid industry in America.
Right.
And you know what? Today, congratulations, it's the lowest paid industry in America. I don't know, maybe teaching might be actually.
No. I was an academic in the late 60s, and I had 3 job offers from various universities. And when I left academics and went into publishing, I couldn't believe this. I started out $10,000 at Macmillan in 1970, 71, 70. And none of the academic jobs that I'd been offered paid less than $20,000. I could not believe that. I did not go into publishing to make money. I'm not a fool. But I didn't believe that it would be that low.
Yeah.
It was much lower than academics. You can make more money. Well, that's 40 years ago. I don't know what the situation is today.
But what I find fascinating about this is that, the importance of books. And when we think about the books that influenced us growing up, the books that we read today, the books that really have had an impact in changing our minds and and introducing us to new concepts, that comes out of the publishing world. That comes out of the book industry. And yet, it's there is a price to pay. And that is, I don't know how we go about changing that except talking about it and trying to make more of a point. Hannah?
Yeah. I personally think that picture books are kind of the final frontier for LGBTQ publishing. That it is such an idea in our culture that queer and trans lives are something that is kind of mature content. And I think that the way to change that is by exposing kids to queer and trans people from the very beginning. And I think that that is kind of where the industry should. And there's all kinds of amazing YA out there, and there's more and more being published every year, but I think that it needs to trickle down younger and younger.
Yeah, just to springboard off of that, the young adult publishing industry is totally ruthless. I don't know, because I'm not a young adult editor myself, even though I'm a writer, I kind of live on that little, cluster on Twitter. And young adult writers and editors will call the industry out. They'll bring up things that are problematic, and, they'll raise their voices up. And I want to, continue to see more of that. But also what I would love to see is I just want to see more works about and by trans and gender nonconforming writers. And also to the point where these writers are not necessarily being labeled as trans and gender nonconforming, but that's what their identity happens to be. And just kind of normalizing it and integrate it into the rest of the society where it's almost just so natural and invisible where you don't think twice.
Sorry. Cindy, please.
I was actually just going to touch upon that about normalizing it. One of the first book I both acquired and edited at 7 Stories Press is Out of Salem. It came out in March, and the thing that Out of Salem. Yeah, by Hal Shreve. It came out in March, and it is about a genderqueer zombie and a Turkish-American lesbian werewolf. And the thing that made me fall in love with this book and write a 2.5-page reader's report was how normal it was that these kids were queer. It was a coming-of-age story, so of course there was talk about the kids coming out. Their sexuality is discussed a lot because they're coming into it, but they have much bigger problems like being a zombie and being a werewolf and eyeballs falling out in church, and the moon is full, and I'm sneezing a lot in class, and my hair's frizzing up, and I know I'm a werewolf. They have bigger issues than being queer. Being queer is never an issue. And I read a lot of the books I read were there when I was an adolescent, and there were queer characters. A lot of the times, their problems were because they were queer. Their narratives were about them being queer. It wasn't just oh yeah, I'm queer and, I have other issues going on that have nothing to do with my queerness. And I feel like we need more of that, and that's the best way to normalize it. And talking about picture books and just other content for children in general, I'm just going to talk about Steven Universe right now because the thing that was really formative about Steven Universe for me was when Stevani happened, and I'm not even going to go into explaining Steven Universe to anyone who doesn't know about it. You just have to look it up. Rebecca Sugar is an amazing writer. But Stevani is a genderqueer fusion. It's a human boy and a half-gem boy and a human girl who fuse together. And when they fuse, they don't know what to do because all the other fusions have been female gems, and so they're always still referred to as she and her. So now you have a little boy and a little girl who are fused together, and it's like, what do we do? We're just going to say that Stephen and Connie are Stevani, and we're just going to refer to them as they and them, and it's never said, oh, how do we address them? It's just, this is now Stevani, they are amazing, they are an experience. And that entire episode just meant so much for me, and it meant a lot to me that my little sister, my youngest sibling is 7, it means a lot to me that she really likes Stevani, because once the gender conversation does have to happen between me and her, I can just be like, oh, well, I'm like Stevani, and she'll just be like, oh, okay, cool. And it'll be as simple as that.
Great, but that's the future. That's what I'd like to think. Yes, that's the future, and that's what will change. That's what will change publishing, what will change the world. Terrific. I'd like to open it up for some questions. Robert?
You haven't mentioned self-publishing, especially in relation to commercial, traditional publishing, not accepting as many manuscripts from the subject we've discussed.
Self-publishing? Have we, that we should be self-publishing?
No, I'm just, what's the role of self-publishing as an avenue for this area? Namely, last year, Bowker issued as many ISBN numbers for self-published titles as official commercial publishing. 300,000 new titles.
I think it's really exciting. As I said, I'm a freelance editor now, and maybe a quarter of my clients self-publish, and some of them do remarkably well. It really depends. The first guy, is a very young man, 26, 27, who did this, that I worked with, wrote a gay science fiction novel. And he was on social media. If you have something that targeted, I mean, this is a 26-year-old, it was his first book, we went through several drafts. In my opinion, he should have gone to at least one more draft, but he was too anxious to put it out. He sold 7,000 copies, now, which absolutely astonished me. But that's because between gay and science fiction, and if you're a young person who happens to understand social media, which I do not, you can really get to that audience very fast. I worked with a guy who wrote a huge book on the golden age of Jewish achievement from 1850 to 1950, who self-published it. And again, he was able to sell many, many thousands of copies because that's a very articulated audience, you know, and if you know how to get to it, and you can get to it virtually free, you know. I have several fiction writers who have actually done, what's it called when you raise money on the internet?
Crowdfunding?
Crowdfunding, Kickstarter.
Yeah, crowdfunding, the Kickstarter thing. I have 3 novelists who've started a Kickstarter thing, you know, raised $4,000 or $5,000 to be able to publish the book themselves, and have done quite well. You know, a first novel, my experience was if you sold over 3,500 copies of a first novel, you're doing pretty well. If you sold 5,000 or 6,000 copies, that was a real relief of a first novel. All 3 of these people have sold that many copies.
And I think the difference, though, if I may just, actually,
I just wanted
yeah.
I just wanted to add something about self-publishing. I was at an event last night, the Lambda Literary Awards, and many, many of the finalists, publishers there were self-published. Many of the contestants, the finalists, were self-published books, and I see it, just from my own experience, a lot of self-published books are category books or genre books. science fiction, fantasy, and they do really, really, really well. I'm not interested in, agents are often not interested unless they do really, really well, and then they can be resold to a mainstream publisher, because most of them already have an ISBN number. And if you look at those ISBN numbers, they can be looked up, and it's usually, the numbers are very, very modest. And it looks like the book has already been published before, which in fact it has. To resell a book like that is taboo. It's just, it's bad. It's like 50 copies sold. Nobody wants you. It's just, it ain't going to happen with me.
I think that's true, because I think, publishers, whether they're small indie or the big five, it's a curation of content. And I was going to say, actually, if it's a Torah book, you kind of know what to expect. You go back to that imprint time and again to read that. So to read authors, because that's kind of the content you like. I think that there's a glut in the market with all of the self-publishing. I mean, when you talk about 300,000 titles, that's a lot of books, and discoverability. Even though that's an issue with some publishers, because not every title in a big publisher gets a lot of money in terms of marketing. But it is out there. It's being sold into the bookstores. Much harder for individual indie published books. But there have been some great success stories.
Well, the thing that I realized while you were talking, I hadn't thought about it this way before. One of the reasons that in the heyday of lesbian small press publishing, not just Firebrand, but in general, was that the lesbian world was absolutely organized to find out about what was being published. There was a huge number of small magazines, newspapers, blah, blah. The then analog to what's happening digitally now. So when you have a genre book, that audience is looking for that book. It just doesn't know it because it hasn't quite found it yet. But we did very little publicity. Review copies with a publicity, basically.
Word of mouth.
Yeah.
Which even today is still word of mouth is important.
Well, and because the world is organized it.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that after a few years, by the late 70s, when I was publishing quite a bit of gay fiction, I would get 40 to 50 reviews from all over the country for a first novel. I published straight fiction, some very good straight fiction. If I got 5 reviews, I was doing well, And for many years, I used to go on these panels, and in the early 80s, everybody still felt very oppressed. But in fact, the gay authors had a much easier situation than the straight authors had. There was just no question. I mean, I could look at the figures. I was going to sell 2 to 3 times with an average gay novel what I would sell with an average for a straight novel. And it was because of the articulation of the audience. When I started, there was something like 5 or 6 gay bookstores in 1971. By 1980, there was something like 46, would you say? Yeah, around that. And they were terrific. And the feminist bookstores. And both were social centers of the community, So, in fact, certainly in the 80s, I think gay authors had an easier job than straight authors because of the articulation of the audience.
Well, I'm glad that we're finally talking about discoverability, because it seems to me this is one of the really key issues that we're facing right now as, readers, writers, and publishers of GLBTQ fiction and non-fiction. And when Nancy talked about how organized the lesbian world was, that was not a glib comment. That was a really serious reflection. There's a book that's been published very recently by one of the UPs. It's called The Lesbian South, and it's about the women in print movement and about June Arnold and Daughters Inc. and Sinister Wisdom and the Great Southern lesbian periodical, the name of which I'm forgetting. But, you know, there was also in the 70s, coming out of the Furies, which was the lesbian feminist collective in Washington, D.C., was Women in Print, which was a distribution company that distributed lesbian and feminist books and periodicals all across the country to a vast network of radical alternative bookstores, lesbian, feminist, and gay bookstores, most of which are now gone.
Right.
And while I understand how sort of social media works for the promotion of a lot of genre fiction, and I think it can be fantastically effective, and while I know that some authors like, say, Alex Chi, who has an incredible presence on both Facebook and Twitter, really know how to work social media, I still feel like we're missing so much because we no longer have a physical home for these books, a bricks and mortar home. And also, you know, when Michael talks about the Frederick Martel book, I mean, that's a really sensational book, for better or worse, perhaps. But it's an incredibly revelatory book, and it was reviewed by the New York Times. But as far as I'm aware, it hit no bestseller lists. And it kind of had a moment and then disappeared. And so what does that say about the status of books in society, in culture today? Because I feel like everything keeps getting smaller and smaller, and perhaps it's more democratic, but the big hits are going away and have been for many, many years, and that ability to make a huge impact in the culture with one huge book. And a lot of it is because we don't have the reviews and we don't have the bookstores. And how do people, this is my question for everyone on the panel, but particularly the younger members of the panel, because I figure you're going to have to work this out. You know, how do readers discover books?
Yeah, you know, I like how you brought up discoverability too, and the fact that, like, you know, one of the two major distributors for indies in this country had shuttered, you know, a couple of weeks ago. So that's a huge thing. And what I think is happening is that readers are using the internet for discoverability, not necessarily social media, but like, you know, SEOs, like search engine terms. You know, your metadata for your book is become like the top thing about your book aside from the text itself. Like if you don't have the right search words for your book, you know, and sometimes it's funny because, you know, you do see it sometimes with nonfiction a lot where, like, you know, they're plugging in certain names and keywords and dropping stuff just so that when someone Googles it afterwards, it's the first thing that pops up as a result. But yeah, we have whole meetings like quarterly when we talk about, all right, these are like the new BISAC codes we have, these are the new data terms that we're using. We have to make sure as editors, which is also really weird because I didn't really sign up to, like, you know, randomly insert like search terms for my books, but okay, to make sure they're discoverable. And you're right, like I think the cultural impact of a book has shifted, you know, partly because our culture in general has become more of a visual culture. And what does that mean? For me, working genre, it is actually to my advantage because everyone is mining genre for IP content right now. So so like if you know, they might not, you know, buy the book right away, but like millions of people watch Game of Thrones, you know, and that is, you know, literally the single like series that is still keeping Bantam alive, you know. And, you know, and things like that. Like, you know, books are hitting the culture, like, in indirect ways, I've seen. You know, unless you're nonfiction, you can sell Fire and Fury and get the cease and desist letter and, you know, and sell millions of copies. But discoverability is a constant question that we're always talking about.
I think what fascinates me the most is that almost so much effort is put into, like, authors' discoverability before they've even come out with their book. Like I've heard other editors mention before that, like, they want to see authors already have a platform or like a following on Twitter or what have you, like even before their book is out, which is absolutely redonkulous. But like Hannah and I were actually talking briefly before the panel that like, you know, years ago you couldn't really put a face to authors and you almost weren't sure what people look like, and now like authors are almost kind of becoming like icons or celebrities now with the way like social media is and how people's presence might be. But yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not offering a solution to your question, but that's like one thing that I'm noticing. It's all this push is almost going into like before your book is maybe picked up yet, or even before it's out. Like another thing too, like so much effort is being put into like pre-orders, which I hadn't realized until recently, like how big that was. Like I've had a short story published in an anthology, and you know, the publisher was pushing to like, hey, like just so you know, share this around. We're trying to get as many people to pre-order it as possible, and I hadn't realized until then that, you know, sales before, you know, the day of release is just as important as, you know.
All right. That's also a way of supporting independent booksellers, which is really important so that they don't keep going away, as you say. But that's what I mentioned before. Is I really think that that's part of what has become backwards about the publishing industry, and in my small way, I really want to change that so that we have the book, and then we say, as a group, how do we reach these audience? What are the audiences for this book? Because I also think it's a mistake to only reach out to like the audience that identifies exactly with the book, because I think readership should be broader than that. But I think you start there, and if you are willing to take the time to individually market a book and publicize a book, it is still possible to reach out in various ways to the book's potential audience. And I think for children's books also there are librarians who are still very powerful, and you can reach out to people who have a broad audience and have a sympathy that is have a sensibility and a sympathy for the book, and you can reach out and get it to those people, and they have a broader voice. So, you know, perhaps once upon a time you would say, you know, I know we're going to get this to the feminist bookstores. Now you might have to reach out to the people who are readers and bloggers and etc. who are feminists, and send them this book, and, you know, say, I hope you like it, I hope you will talk about it.
I wonder too if it's in part almost a detriment, because you're defining your readers before the book's even out, and I wonder if it's, you know, you're kind of like pigeonholing your readership before they can define themselves and come and discover your book. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, but it seems to me you always have to, I mean, I agree with Arthur, you always start focusing on the hardcore market.
Right.
I mean, yes, you try to expand it, but, I mean, if you're in a business, you've got to focus on the most likely sales that you're going to get.
Start somewhere.
The hardcore targeted market is where I always began, and then tried to expand it outward.
I have another question just before we all wrap up. So publishing frequently identifies itself as like a liberal industry, yet it seems very selective about what kinds of diversity it allows in and what kinds it's not. So I'm thinking about how only recently have there been trans people working in publishing, and from what I've seen, it's only non-binary assigned female at birth trans people. And other groups have yet to kind of break in. And I'm kind of curious about what that's like on the inside, as well as kind of what is it going to take to get more voices help with hands producing books.
Anyone want to take that?
Can you say that again? Because I was following you, but I...
Yeah. So I'm just thinking about the, as I have seen publishing work harder to diversify, there are a select number of types that are getting these positions and jobs. A lot of times I notice that publishers like diversity, they can photograph. So it's kind of people with visible disabilities, people of color with darker skin that are kind of being put up as posters, which is an issue of marketing diversity generally. But kind of how is that being experienced from the inside, and also what does it take to kind of push to the next level of who's getting these jobs?
Well, partially it depends on who's trying to be employed in publishing. The one class that you didn't mention, to me, is the overwhelming. I mean, publishing is overwhelmingly middle class. There are almost no, I come from very working class people. There are almost no working class people working in publishing. I believe there are probably more African Americans working in publishing than literal working class people, because all the African Americans I've met in publishing have basically been middle class people, which makes sense. They have to have a certain education, et cetera, to get in the door. What happened, say, at St. Martin's in the 70s was once I started publishing gay books and didn't get fired. I mean, I used to say, all I have to do is stand here and not get struck by lightning, and it'll prove the point. Very slowly what happened, because we got a lot of publicity for our gay publishing, because I didn't have big ad budgets, and that was one way to get free publicity for all the books, was after about 5 years, I started, in publishing there are an enormous number of assistants. Assistant editors, assistants in the art department, in the publicity department, in the design, in virtually every department except sales. And assistants usually work 2 to 4 or 5 years before moving on. There's a very rapid turnover in assistants. And after about 5 years, I noticed more and more of the young assistants were gay or lesbian. Until after I'd been at St. Martin, by say 1985, I would have guessed that 50% of the younger staff was gay or lesbian. Because if you were gay or lesbian and you wanted to go into publishing, then you ended up wanting to go to St. Martin's because it was the only place that was publishing gay books and that was getting a lot of publicity about it. And what happened, see where I disagree with you about only being interested in one's own type of thing, is after I proved that you could survive by publishing gay books, first of all, the 2 or 3 other editors who in fact were gay, who had never published anything gay or been out about it, started publishing gay. But within a couple of years, the straight editors were publishing gay books. And it became a totally normalized thing,
But I think what he's asking is, really, I think we're being more aware of transgender, and you're asking why aren't there more transgender individuals working in publishing, or how do you prove that? But also, how do you determine
that aspect of diversity?
Right.
Yeah.
I think your question consists of like a couple of different points. So like the first point mainly about, and there's totally separate issues that I think are both super important. One is how we frame representation and how the gatekeepers, we say gatekeepers, we mean all of us on stage. We actually also mean people in HR, people who are hiring, in general, and how do we get more people in the door, and how the understanding of that is framed. That's one general question. And the other is, I think you're kind of tell me if I'm wrong. I think you're expressing an anxiety about how much, a particular identity affects getting through that door. How much do I have to assimilate to a certain type of culture, or how to pass a certain standard in order to be accepted? And I think those are two drastically different questions, because what I've seen a lot happening in the past 5 years, Liam Lowe had a survey, and it was just covering people of color, but they also covered LGBTQ people, like the PW has like a survey, the salary survey, which also kind of overlaps a little bit too. Just showing like what kind of people, are working in publishing and how do they identify. And one thing that has been seen consistently, is, change is like super incremental, but also there's still a really high turnover rate. And I've seen this, anecdotally and personally too, where you'd have a wave of entry-level people who, who are, very diverse, and, they burn out, or they have, or they have suffer like issues of discrimination, which they can't talk about, to their superiors, because it was generally understood to be a very liberal company or something like that, and they didn't understand that discrimination still happens, like that it can be systemic and not just personal, and that people who identify as part of the dominant culture, they're so culpable in ways that they may not realize, and that's still reflecting their actions and how they interact with other people. So, I've been in publishing, for about 12 years. And I feel like every 3 years or so, there's always a wave of people that change is happening. Like, look, there's like another person of color in the department. Or like, look, like I'm not the only one who's like a queer woman of color, at this company. But then they would leave, but they would confess to me what happened to them. And they wouldn't tell, they couldn't bring it up to a higher level. And they'd only talk about it at the exit interview because they knew they could get away with it. And it consistently happens over and over again. It is super frustrating because on the outside, you're like, oh, look at the hiring numbers. Look at the people coming in. And they don't know how to retain the talented workforce that they try to recruit. And I think that is a serious, serious problem that still needs to be addressed. And I guess like you're in talking about your anxiety, I think that is part of it. Like you might be seeing a lot of people coming in, but you don't know what their actual experience in the company is. Like as you were saying that, for example, about how you didn't really come out until like after the election. You thought it was super pertinent now, and I think just coming in, into publishing, there's always a tension that because ultimately it is a mass media industry. And, we were the first mass media, us the newspapers, and so what does that mean? We're interacting with the wider world, with the wider general public. When you're, especially now, when you can be seen and Googled and photographed and recorded, and what kind of risk does that take? And I think a common thread that everyone has been talking about tonight, whether they started their career as closeted or whether they came out in the process of working in the industry, is that anxiety is still there. No matter how much we feel the company, or the industry or the community is being open or accepting, there's always that fear because we have lived all these experiences that we never talk about, where that has come back to hurt us. And I think what may help, perhaps, is to really find the community, because the transgender community in New York City is so vibrant, and it's so wide-reaching, and there's so many creative people. I'm more than happy to talk about you after panel, and think that is really the core, is to find your people, support your people in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't have to be a huge way. It can be taking someone out to coffee. It can be writing back that email, when they wrote the thank you email after like the interview, like, oh yes, feel free to like touch base, keep in touch. And I think it's really, again, discoverability, it's really those connections that we forge with each other in large and small ways that can hopefully snowball into greater change.
I think this is great. That's great.
I think also that there's a couple of ways that the publishers can express their welcoming to trans employees, and one of them is by being specific, like specifically saying in your advertising for positions, we welcome trans candidates in that spectrum of people that they're saying. Go out of your way to say you are welcome, you are invited, and then the other way, I think, is to speak through your publishing. Like, I think if, correct me if I'm wrong, Parrish, but if you saw like a bunch of really vibrantly diverse publishing that had different kinds of trans representation, perhaps that would make you feel like, okay, this is a company I would feel excited to be part of. And if more companies did that, then more trans publishing professionals would be interested, I think.
I think I'm going to piggyback off both of you, piggybacking off of Arthur with inviting, like being very explicit that you are welcoming trans people to work for your company. If you're ever on a job board or you're applying to a company, usually when they ask you what your gender is, they ask for male or female. They don't ask for anything else, or they don't leave a bubble for you to fill in whatever you want. And that right there is an indicator that they are kind of closed in their ability to understand different genders or the gender spectrum. Even something as simple as going to an interview and the interviewer asking what your pronouns are the moment you get into the interview. Like, it's very simple, but it means a lot. And piggybacking off of Diana with the talk about community, a lot of, and I'm going to address something you said, Michael, a lot of the times when you're in a workplace, you gravitate towards people who look like you. 7 Stories has 10 full-time employees, and I am the only person of color on staff. I have been to panels and lectures at Penguin Random House, and at a copywriting workshop there were at least 75 to 80 people in the room, and I could count 7 people of color in a room of 75 to 80 people. Wow. And it's, and to also talk about working class, I, as a black person who went to a state university, was told in my publishing career, early in my publishing career, that I was lucky to have a job in publishing considering I went to a SUNY, and that had I gone to Columbia or NYU, I probably would have been better off. And so it's not really about, oh, there are more people of color, there are more black people in publishing than the working class, because a lot of people of color are from the working class. And we get our education not because we have the money to get the education. So many of us are in debt, talking again about how low the starting salary is in publishing. I can only imagine how many people, especially people of color who work in publishing, will never be able to, may never be able to pay off the debt and the college expenses it took them to get them where they are. So it's about finding people that look like you, and that anxiety that you're experiencing and that you're talking about, any person, any marginalized person feels that at any job. Any brown person walks into a room full of people and looks for other brown people. Any visibly queer person walks into a room full of people and looks for other visibly queer people, someone who looks like me, who I can connect to. And so if you already don't see that at jobs, then you're not going to apply to those jobs, because no one wants to be the odd man out. No one wants to feel like the token.
Yes.
I want to take an unpopular position here. I think if we wait until we're invited in, had gay people waited till we were invited into publishing, we never would have been in publishing. And the idea that they've got to make it easy, or they've got to make it even possible for any minority group to survive, I mean, it's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen. They're not going to do it. I mean, if you want to be in publishing, you have to fight your way in.
Yes, but
and then you have to mentor other people, which I agree with, and basically fight.
Well, that might
But can I just say, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Arthur, and then I'm going to finish up. Go ahead.
Okay, I think that those things aren't mutually exclusive, first of all. I think that, given that we did fight our way in, we can try to, open doors behind us, and, it can be a both-way process. Like, we who are in it can think, how can we, make it easier? How can we make it more welcoming? It's certainly, we don't have to stay like, well, we did it, we fought our way in, now you fight your way out me.
Yes, I think the truth is that there's still a lot of challenges that we continue to face. And I think it's easy to say, yes, you can fight your way in, and it's easy if you are
I'm
white,
not saying you can fight
certain
your way
gender,
in. I'm saying if you
like,
don't fight your way in, you're not going to get in. If you rely on them to let us in, as it were, it ain't going to work.
But I think
it never has worked.
I think it's also hard. I mean, I think there are a lot of challenges to that. Again, if you are a person of color, it's easy because it's harder to go into a white working class or a white professional environment because you're immediately the other. And I think I think that's more of a challenge. So yes, we fought our way in, but we fought our way in perhaps as white, and gender wasn't so. I mean, I wore the skirts Molly was talking about. That was what you wore if you were a woman working, and that's what you did. You followed those. You followed those rules, and yes, you infiltrated in a way. Harder when it's so obvious that you are different. So I think there are a lot of challenges, but I think that is what makes it, can make it exciting. And I think there are ways around, and thinking about, I think part of the digital age is, and what Robert was saying earlier about self-publishing, I think that there's a lot more opportunity for smaller companies and to create your own publishing and to do what you think is worthwhile and to pursue it. But here we are 50 years after Stonewall, and I have to say, when I first came out, my parents could have put me into a mental hospital for being gay. And today, we have the privilege to marry, we have children, and I think we're living a different life than we were 50 years ago, which means that things can change. But you have to have that commitment to change, which is, I think, what you're saying, having that commitment to change, and that we're at a different place, I think a better place, and the only answer is to go forward with that. So thank you all for coming.